The entire kitchen went quiet, the moment the health inspector walked in and declared the restaurant unsalvageable. 3 Michelin-starred chefs shook their heads before the man even finished his sentence. One of them muttered loud enough for everyone to hear that kitchens like this didn't come back from citations like these. Another pulled out his phone and started photographing the violations the way someone documents a car crash. Not to help, but to remember. Standing near the prep station in a perfectly tailored blazer, hotel magnate Caroline Vance listened without expression as the lead inspector delivered his conclusion. Condemned. The kitchen that had fed presidents, celebrities, and dignitaries for 40 years was finished. The crown jewel of her late father's hospitality empire was now just a room full of stainless steel waiting to be gutted, and then, from the back of the kitchen near the walk-in refrigerator, a heavy-set line cook with flour on his forearms and exhaustion written into every line of his face quietly said something nobody expected. "I've seen worse, I can bring this back." Nobody laughed out loud. But almost everyone smiled. They would remember that smile later. Every single one of them. If you believe in second chances, in the kind of quiet dignity that doesn't announce itself but simply shows up and does the work. Take a moment to like this video, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Dignity Tales for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Joel Beckett had spent the better part of 20 years making food that other people got credit for. At 43, he worked as a line cook at the Alderton Grand Hotel in Louisville, Kentucky. Not the glamorous part of the hotel district. Not the part that got photographed or reviewed, but the part that kept everything running, from 4 in the morning until the last room service order cleared at midnight. He was a large man, quiet in the way that people who have survived real grief tend to be quiet. Not withdrawn, just measured. Like someone who learned a long time ago that words cost something, so you'd better mean them before you spend them. He had not always been a line cook. 15 years earlier, Joel was the kind of young chef that culinary schools put in their brochures. He trained in Lyon, he staged in Copenhagen, he came home to Louisville with a thick notebook of recipes, a head full of ideas about flavor and technique that his instructors called genuinely original, and a plan to open a restaurant that would say something new about Southern food. Not fusion, not ironic. Just honest. The kind of cooking that remembered where it came from without being ashamed of where it was going. He met Claire at a farmer's market the spring he came back. She was buying dried chiles from a vendor who clearly didn't know what he had, and she was explaining patiently to the man exactly what each variety was good for. Joel stood nearby pretending to examine garlic and listening to her talk, and by the time she noticed him, he had already decided she was the most interesting person he'd encountered since returning home. They were married 14 months later. Their daughter, Sophie, arrived 2 years after that, small and loud and absolutely certain about everything, which Joel said she got from Claire, and Claire said she got from Joel. The restaurant plan moved slowly, while they saved money and scouted locations. That was fine. Joel was patient. He cooked his ideas at home on weekends, while Sophie sat on the kitchen counter, handing him spoons and commenting authoritatively on everything he made. Claire handled the business side, spreadsheets, projections, a whole binder of research she updated monthly. They were methodical, they were careful, they were, by every reasonable measure, ready. And then Claire went to the doctor for a routine checkup in the fall of Sophie's 3rd year. And the word the doctor used was aggressive, and the world they had built together with such patience and such care began to come apart at the speed that only real catastrophe can manage. Joel doesn't talk about the 2 years that followed. Not in detail. People who knew him then describe a man who kept moving, because stopping felt like drowning. He cooked at the hospital, he cooked at home. He brought food to the nurses who were kind to Claire, and food to the waiting rooms full of other families circling the same darkness. Cooking was the only thing his hands knew how to do when his mind couldn't hold a single coherent thought. Claire died on a Tuesday morning in early March, a week before Sophie's 5th birthday. Joel had been awake for 31 hours. He held her hand until it went still, and then he went home and made Sophie pancakes, shaped like rabbits, because that's what she'd asked for the night before, and keeping that small promise felt like the only thing he could control in the entire world. The restaurant dream was gone by then. The savings were gone. The binder Claire kept was still on the shelf in their home office, updated through the previous September in her handwriting, and Joel couldn't bring himself to move it for 3 years. He took whatever kitchen work he could find. He was overqualified for all of it, and he never mentioned that to anyone, and the people who hired him mostly didn't know enough to realize what they had. He moved through hotel kitchens and catering companies, and one brief, disastrous stint at a corporate cafeteria in Cincinnati that lasted 4 months before he and Sophie came back to Louisville, because she was miserable and he was worse. He settled at the Alderton Grand because the hours were stable, the sous chef left him alone, and the walk to Sophie's school was 12 minutes on foot. Sophie was 10 now. She did her homework at a small table in the corner of the prep kitchen on the nights Joel worked late, and the staff had long since adopted her as an unofficial mascot. She had opinions about everything: stock reduction, knife technique, the best way to fold a napkin. And she delivered these opinions with the serene confidence of someone who had never once been wrong. Joel watched her sometimes from across the kitchen and felt something that sat between pride and pain, in a place that didn't have a clean name. He was not unhappy. That's important to understand. He had Sophie. He had work that he was good at. He had a small apartment with a fire escape where he grew tomatoes in the summer and where he and Sophie ate dinner together every night. He wasn't on a late shift. It was a small life, and it was his, and he had stopped apologizing for it, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. But he had also stopped believing that anything larger was still available to him. That was about to change in a way he could not have predicted and would not have asked for, in a hotel kitchen full of fluorescent lights and stainless steel and the smell of industrial cleaner. On a Wednesday afternoon in November, Caroline Vance controlled one of the largest privately held hospitality groups in the American Southeast. At 41, she had spent the decade since her father's death building Vance Hospitality into something that exceeded even his considerable ambitions. 32 properties across 7 states, a corporate staff of 400, a reputation for operational precision that her competitors respected and her employees described with the particular mixture of awe and exhaustion that tends to accompany very demanding bosses. She was not cruel. She was demanding in the way that people who grew up watching someone they loved work themselves to the edge of everything tend to become demanding. As if relaxing standards was a form of dishonor. Her father, Harold Vance, had built his empire on one foundational property, the Alderton Grand. He opened it in 1981 with borrowed money and a conviction that Louisville deserved a hotel that took itself seriously. The kitchen was his pride. He personally oversaw the design of the original prep layout, sourced the first equipment, spent 3 weeks in the building before opening day tasting everything that came out of it. When he died, he left Caroline the company and a request she couldn't quite fulfill, that the Alderton remain exactly as he'd built it, a working monument to what serious hospitality looked like. The problem was that the Alderton's kitchen was, in fact, a monument to 1987 in ways that had begun to matter legally. The health department's visit was not entirely unexpected. There had been complaints. Serious. Nothing that made the news, but the kind of accumulating small violations that signal a larger reckoning approaching. When the lead inspector, a methodical man named Frank DeSoto, arrived with his clipboard and his assistant and his flashlight, he moved through the kitchen, with the deliberate care of someone who had already made up his mind, and was now simply building the documentation. By the time he finished, he had listed 43 violations. 17 were classified as critical. His recommendation, delivered to Caroline and the hotel's general manager in the main dining room afterward, was full closure pending complete renovation. A process he estimated would take 8 to 12 months minimum. Caroline sat very still while he spoke. The general manager, a nervous man named Arthur Gillen, took notes with the mechanical focus of someone who needed to look busy to avoid thinking about what the notes meant. The renovation estimate was $6 million. The closure would cost twice that in lost revenue. The Alderton's kitchen had not closed for more than 4 days in 40 years. Harold Vance had kept it running through 2 recessions, a flood, and a kitchen fire that destroyed the east wall in 1994. She was still sitting there after DeSoto and his assistant left, staring at the list of violations, when the kitchen staff began drifting back in to resume prep for the dinner service, that now wouldn't happen. Word had spread quickly. Some of them stood in small groups talking quietly. Others just stood alone, looking at the equipment they'd worked around for years, with new eyes. Noticing, maybe for the first time, how old everything actually was. Joel had heard the inspector's summary through the pass-through window. He stood at his station for a long moment after, then walked slowly to the center of the kitchen, and looked around at it, the way he looked at a dish that had gone wrong. Not with despair, but with the particular focused attention of someone trying to understand exactly what the problem was, and whether it was fixable. Arthur spotted him from the doorway, and started to say something about everyone going home for the day. Joel turned toward Caroline instead. She looked at him for the first time. Not with recognition, she didn't know who he was, but with the reflexive attention of someone who had learned to read rooms quickly. He was not what she expected the speaker to look like: flour-dusted, tired in the face, work boots with the right toe starting to separate from the sole. He said he'd been in this kitchen for 4 years. He said he'd worked in 12 hotel kitchens across 3 states before that. He said he had never seen a kitchen that couldn't be brought back if someone approached it correctly. He was not loud. He did not seem to need her to believe him. He spoke the way someone speaks when they're telling you something true and they know it, and whether you accept it is your problem to work through, not theirs. Caroline asked him what he meant by correctly. Joel said most renovation consultants approached a condemned kitchen the way demolition crews approached a condemned building. Strip everything out, start over, spend the maximum amount of money returning to a clean zero. But a kitchen like this one wasn't a zero. It had 40 years of operational knowledge built into its layout. The flow between stations, the relationship between the prep area and the line, the positioning of the walk-ins relative to the loading dock. That knowledge was structural. You couldn't buy it back once you threw it away. The right approach was surgical: address the violations with precision, upgrade what needed upgrading, and preserve what still worked. Done properly, he said, you were looking at 4 months, not 8. And closer to 3 million than 6. He stopped talking and looked at her steadily. Nobody in the room made a sound. Arthur started to say something about liability and insurance, and the inspector's official recommendation, and Caroline raised one hand slightly without looking at him, and he stopped. She asked Joel his name. He told her. Joel Beckett. She asked how long it would take him to write down what he'd just described. He said 24 hours. She said she'd be back at 10 o'clock Thursday morning. What followed was the most focused 24 hours of Joel's professional life since culinary school. He stayed in the kitchen until 2 in the morning, moving through every station with a flashlight and a legal pad, cataloging exactly what each violation represented mechanically, and what addressing it would require. Sophie slept on the folding cot that lived in the prep office for her late-night visits, tucked under her jacket, her math homework still open beside her. At one point around midnight she woke up and watched him work in silence for a few seconds, then said, quietly, that she thought it was going to be okay, Dad, and went back to sleep. He stood still for a moment after she said that. Then he kept writing. The document he produced was 31 pages. It included a phased remediation plan, a suggested vendor list based on pricing he pulled from industry contacts he hadn't spoken to in years, a month-by-month timeline, and a section at the end where he described in plain language the specific design logic of Harold Vance's original kitchen layout, how the positions of things reflected a philosophy about efficiency and hospitality that was worth preserving, and what would be lost if the renovation ignored it. He printed it at the front desk at 7 in the morning and went home to shower. Sophie made him eat toast before he left. Caroline arrived at 9:58. She read the document standing at the kitchen's main prep table, not sitting, turning pages steadily, occasionally going back to reread something. It took her 40 minutes. Arthur stood nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable. 2 members of Caroline's corporate team hovered near the door. When she finished, she closed the document and looked at Joel. She asked who had helped him write it. Nobody, he said. She asked where he learned to think about kitchen architecture this way. He said he'd spent 15 years fixing things he'd been told couldn't be fixed. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Just slightly. She asked if he had time to walk her through the kitchen. They spent 2 hours walking it together. Joel showed her what he meant about each section. Which violations were critical, and which were cosmetic. Which systems could be repaired rather than replaced. Which layout decisions her father had made, that were genuinely brilliant, and not simply familiar. He talked about Harold Vance's approach, the way someone talks about a mentor they never met, with a kind of precise respect that comes from studying someone's work closely enough to understand the thinking behind it. Caroline walked quietly beside him, asking sharp questions, listening to the answers, with the full attention of someone who rarely has to work at paying attention. At one point, near the pastry station where a section of tile had been flagged for water damage, she asked how he knew so much about her father's original design choices. He said he'd found the original 1980 patents in the maintenance files 2 years ago and read them, because he was curious. He said Harold had annotated them in pen. Small notes in the margins about why he'd made particular decisions. Joel had found those notes more interesting than most of what he'd read in culinary school. Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she said her father used to annotate everything. That he believed the reasons for decisions mattered as much as the decisions themselves. Joel said he agreed with that. They finished the walk and stood in the center of the kitchen in the quiet of a building that wasn't running yet. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. A line of prep tables stretched toward the far wall, like a timeline of everything this room had produced. Caroline said she wanted to think overnight. Joel said that was reasonable. At home, Sophie asked how it went. He said he didn't know yet. She accepted this with the pragmatic patience of a child who has learned that some things take time, and they ate dinner, and she told him about a book she was reading, and he listened and thought about nothing else for the rest of the night. Caroline called at 7 the next morning. She offered him the position of kitchen restoration director. A title that hadn't existed 20 minutes before she invented it. She wanted him to oversee the entire remediation project, working directly with contractors, managing the vendor relationships, and ensuring that what came out the other side reflected the operational philosophy her father had built into the original. She named a salary that was almost exactly double what he was currently making. She said she expected the project to take 4 months, and she was holding him to that. He asked if he could have until noon to decide. She said yes. He took Sophie to school. He walked back slowly, past the farmer's market, where Claire used to buy dried chiles on Saturday mornings, past the small park where the three of them had spent 100 weekend afternoons before everything changed. He sat on a bench for a while. He thought about the binder still on the shelf in his home office, with Claire's handwriting in it. Updated through the last September, she was well. He thought about Sophie saying it was going to be okay, Dad, in the voice she'd inherited from a woman she was starting to remember only in pieces. He called Caroline at 11:47. He said yes. The 4 months that followed were the hardest sustained work Joel had done since the period after Claire died, when keeping himself functional had required the same daily discipline that the restoration project now demanded. He arrived before the contractors and left after them. He learned quickly that his role was as much translation as it was expertise, taking the language of culinary operations and rendering it comprehensible to electricians and plumbers and tile contractors who had never thought about kitchen flow in their lives. He made mistakes. He caught mistakes. He redesigned 2 sections twice when the first solutions didn't hold up under operational simulation. He slept badly and ate well, because the one thing he never let slip was the quality of what he cooked during the occasional working lunches he provided for the contractors, which became, quietly, the most anticipated part of everyone's day. Sophie visited on Saturdays. She had opinions about the tile color choice, and made them known clearly to anyone who would listen. One of the contractors, a big man named Russell, who had been skeptical of Joel from day one, became a dedicated supporter after Sophie explained to him, at some length, why her father was the best cook she had ever seen or would ever see, and why anyone who doubted that was working against their own interests. Word moved through the hospitality industry the way it always does, faster than anyone intends and with more distortion than anyone expects. There were articles speculating that the Alderton Grand's kitchen was being quietly shut down permanently. A competitor hotel group made a formal offer to purchase the property. Industry insiders wrote that Vance Hospitality was overextended, and the flagship property was the first sign of a retreat. Caroline watched all of it from a distance and said nothing publicly. Joel watched none of it. He had a kitchen to rebuild. The reopening was scheduled for a Thursday evening in March, exactly 4 months and 6 days after the health department inspection. Caroline had organized it as a private event. A dinner, for 40 journalists and industry contacts, and a few longtime guests of the Alderton who had been loyal for decades. No press release. No announcement. She wanted the work to speak. The afternoon of the dinner, Joel stood alone in the kitchen for 30 minutes before his team arrived. He walked every station. He ran his hand along the prep tables. He stood at the center pass and looked out at the dining room through the window, the way he had looked at it every working day for 4 years, but differently, now. The kitchen had its bones backs. You could feel it. The layout moved the way Harold Vance had intended it to move, but it was cleaner now. More precise, the violations addressed so thoroughly that the inspector who had condemned it returned for the pre-opening walkthrough and stood in the middle of the room, looking slightly puzzled, as if he couldn't quite locate what had changed to produce something so different from the disaster he'd catalogued. He cited 0 violations. Dinner service that evening ran like something that had been rehearsed 1,000 times. The food Joel produced was not the same as what the Alderton's kitchen had served for 40 years. It was better, rooted in the same commitment to ingredient and place that Harold had built into the property's identity, but speaking in a language that was distinctly Joel's. The journalists at the table recognized it. 3 of them asked, before the main course arrived, who the chef was. Toward the end of the evening, Caroline stood at the front of the dining room. She thanked her guests, briefly, without theater. She talked about her father, and what this building meant to the company he'd built, and the family he'd raised. She said the Alderton's kitchen had been declared unsalvageable by every qualified expert who'd looked at it, and that the only person who had disagreed was a line cook with flour on his arms, who had read her father's original blueprints out of curiosity, and understood them better than most people who had been paid to study them. She said his name. Joel was standing in the kitchen doorway. He didn't move toward the dining room, he didn't need to, but he heard his name said clearly in a room full of people who were suddenly very interested in who he was, and something in his chest moved in a way that had been still for a long time. Then Caroline said something that nobody in the room had anticipated. She assessed the creation of a new culinary program. The Vance Beckett Culinary Residency, to be housed at the Alderton Grand, and funded through the company's foundation. It would provide 2-year paid residencies to chefs from underrepresented backgrounds who had the skill and the vision, but not the platform. It would train them not just in technique, but in the architecture of running a kitchen. The operational and philosophical dimension that distinguished a cook from a builder of something lasting. The program would be directed by Joel. It carried his name alongside her father's. Joel had known about the residency. They had discussed it through the final weeks of the renovation, in early morning conversations over coffee, in the still unfinished kitchen. He had given input on the structure, pushed back on 2 aspects he thought needed rethinking. Contributed significantly to the language of the mission statement. He was not surprised by the announcement. He was surprised by how it felt to hear it said out loud in public, in a room that was applauding. Not because of the recognition, at 43 after the decade he'd had, felt like something that arrived too late to change the basic facts of who he was. What moved him was something smaller and harder to name. The sense that the work he had done in the years since Claire died, the slow daily work of staying functional, and raising Sophie and showing up to kitchens that didn't particularly deserve him, had been accumulating into something. That it had not simply been survival. That survival, done with enough care and enough stubbornness, had turned into something else entirely without him noticing. He thought about Sophie at the table in the prep kitchen, handing him pens and issuing opinions. He thought about Claire's binder on the shelf. He went back into the kitchen after the applause ended, and the dining room filled again with conversation. There was service to finish. That had not changed, it would not change. The kitchen runs, or it doesn't, and the question of which one is always answered by what you do next. Later, after the last cover cleared, and the team had broken down their stations and the building had gone quiet. In the way that buildings go quiet. After they've been used well, Joel sat on a stool at the prep table with a cup of coffee and thought about what his life looked like from a distance. It did not look like the life he had planned. It looked like something harder, and more real, and shaped by things he would not have chosen. But the kitchen he'd rebuilt was better than the one he'd been handed, and the man sitting in it had learned, through years of loss and work and patience, that better is not a destination. It is a direction. He finished his coffee, he turned off the lights, he drove home. Sophie was asleep, but she'd left a note on the kitchen table that said simply, "Told you so." He stood there in the dark kitchen for a long moment, reading it. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket, where it's stayed for a long time after. Have you ever been told something you were building wasn't worth finishing? Have you ever kept going anyway, not because you were certain, but because stopping felt like a betrayal of something you couldn't name? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe to Dignity Tales, where we tell the stories of people who do the quiet, difficult work of rebuilding, one careful day at a time.